What role does politics play in the school construction process? Is the bidding process fair and competitive, or do the contracts go to the biggest campaign donors and developers who have large law firms with political clout?
Established a task force that was to determine the use of that property. We were to put the 13 acres and 24 acres together to make the entire project. That task force included representatives from the community, the business leaders, teachers, the unions, classified unions, parents, a whole group of people.
I was hired by the school district to do exactly that, to start looking, assisting them with finding construction sites that they could acquire, assisting them with the legal process of building schools, which is very technical in California. And it evolved over time into my becoming part of a project team that was specifically created to start knocking down the barriers to school construction.
When it comes to fraud, there's I call it a fraud triangle. There's opportunity, motive, and rationalization. There's opportunities for people to commit fraud. People have motives to commit it, and then they rationalize that it's okay. You know, everybody else does it. I'm going to give the money back. I deserve that promotion, therefore I'm going to take this money. So our primary role is to reduce that opportunity.
Belmont itself was originally conceived to be a multi-use, I won't say joint-use facility. It was going to have a grocery store at the bottom. It was going to have housing. It was going to have quite a number of components that really weren't permitted by law at the time in the state of California.
And what we found was enormous waste, fraud, and abuse. It was a tragedy because they knew, they being the school district and the people developing the property, at all times about the environmental hazards. This school was being built on an old oil field, which is not unusual in Los Angeles. Many of our properties, including our downtown Central Library, is built on an old oil field. The problem is that you have methane, a gas that comes out of that oil field, as well as hydrogen sulfide, a more dangerous gas. It's the one that smells like rotten eggs. You have to make sure that you take care of those gases by venting them, capturing them, and eliminating them from human exposure. That was not done at Belmont, and that is the central reason the school is not occupied today.
Don't we have laws that mandate that there be mitigation and protections against hazardous environmental conditions?
Absolutely. Belmont complied with all of those.
They did?
Absolutely.
Then why is it that some people believe that the contractor didn't comply? Where do they get that impression?
Leslie, the problem is the whole issue has to do with the union dispute at the New Otani. It has nothing to do with the environmental condition of the Belmont site. That is one of those issues that people create to encourage hysteria. And the fundamental issue of Belmont has to do with the hotel workers union and the New Otani, and not with the oil field.
Is it possible that the people that wanted to get rid of that property and sell it to the LA Unified School District so they wouldn't have to clean it up?
That's correct. And in fact, the ironic thing is that when that property was appraised as if there was no environmental contamination on the site. The State Division of Oil and Gas, in a letter written to LAUSD, told them they could not find a worse site imaginable to build a school.
How can the Inspector General dig out all this stuff with all of these exhibits and everything and have nothing be wrong?
Well, there's a lot wrong. The Belmont High School project, the Belmont Learning Center, was probably the worst public works disaster perhaps in the history of the country, at least in terms of school building. A lot went wrong over there.
You have to realize that you had school districts that were not accustomed to swimming with sharks, with developers. And in many cases, developers were able to sell them a bill of goods, which actually, in the final analysis, cost the districts money instead of generating the kind of money that they had anticipated.
I think what happened here is you had a very weak customer. You had professionals who knew the customer was weak. They realized they could get more money for doing not a complete job. Complete job's hard work. You've got to make sure you do your paper right, dot your I's, cross your T's. Good lawyers work very hard, and they're very fastidious about making sure everything is done according to the code and the regulations. That didn't happen here. We had slipshod legal work. We had very poor accounting standards. We had 3 people reviewing bills, And they approved a bill for concrete for a floor when there's dirt there today. Now, how is that possible? You have to accept that the school district got ripped off by the professionals that it hired. Shame on the school district for being ripped off, but shame on the professionals for taking advantage of the school district.
In California, you have a competitive bid process where the lowest bidder is chosen to build the project. The state architect approves the plans, and then you go ahead and build the school. But in the Belmont situation, the district actually chose the most expensive developer rather than the cheapest.
Temple Beaudry Partners the highest bidder for the project?
It wasn't a bid. It was a request for proposal, and it wasn't one that asked for a bid. We asked for them to develop a plan.
My belief is the property was not suitable for any kind of development. And in fact, after the methane explosion at Fairfax, the city had put in very strict environmental regulations which would have prohibited the construction of almost anything at that site. What the LA Unified School District essentially did with this developer is by having a school there, which was really a development project, not a school project, but having a school on the site, they went into a whole different array of laws and basically eliminated the oversight of the city.
Oh, my
in many
goodness.
cases. So frankly, you change the whole environment when you build a school. The school at this point was something of an excuse to build a development project.
And I really want to emphasize that it was not a development project. It was a school project.
The primary problem was still that the two developers who weren't chosen were planning on building a school, and the retail component and those other components were less part of their project. They didn't anticipate the millions and millions and millions of dollars that the Turner Construction in Kajima actually had told the district that this project would generate. What we found in our partnerships report is that there were, I believe, 7 projects like this in LA Unified School District around the same time, and none of them have ever generated very much money for the district.
Well, I'm just reading from this Inspector General's report.
Yeah. Well, let me just take 1 second to comment on that report. It's a work of fiction.
Fiction.
As is the report from the so-called Joint Legislative Audit Committee. These are works of fiction. It's like going to the bestseller list, buying a book, and assuming what's written is true when it's actually written by a novelist.
I was under the impression from the people that we've talked with that at one point there was actually a confession from one of the contractors that they had fraudulently and submitted a fraudulent bill.
That's right.
You know that for a fact?
I was in the room. I heard the confession. Confession's a strong word. We were interviewing the various subcontractors, trying to understand how they developed their bills. And we were informed by one subcontractor, the gentleman who owned the business, that he had been told by the prime contractor to prepare his bill in a certain way, which would allow the prime contractor and the subcontractor to both get paid for that particular item.
When you looked at the fact the appraisers were told not to include the environmental conditions when appraising the land value, that there were kickbacks and there was bid rigging, and there was what I call a license to steal.
They were talking about false billings
and they were
kickbacks. And
all of those things were disproved. Those type of allegations were primarily made by the unions. They were not true. They were absolutely incorrect, and not a single one of those charges has any verification at all to it.
Really?
Every law firm, every accounting firm has licensed individuals. They're sworn to uphold the law, and they're sworn to an ethical code. All of those codes were breached here. And I think the central issue is the same issue it always is, money.
But in the Belmont case, what you had a lot of subcontractors that were billing for work that was never done, or for billing for supplies that were never brought to the site. And this is something that the Inspector General, in his excellent report, amply described the criminal fraud that was involved with those false claims.
The developer said there was no methane gas on the southern part of the lot. They discovered, after making that representation to the fire department, that there was methane. Did they report it immediately? No. They waited months to report that until after they had built the buildings. Now, clearly that's evidence that any prosecutor would look at and say, hey, wait a minute. Furthermore, you can walk into Belmont today and find floors for which the school district paid good money for concrete that are still dirt.
How do you feel about corruption? How do you feel about contractors that try to take advantage of a school district.
Yeah. In this case, the corruption had nothing to do with the contractor. It had everything to do with the hotel workers union and a dispute over the unionization of the staff at the New Atani Hotel.
Personal responsibility in the school system was lacking for a long time. Even if we go back and talk about Belmont, we couldn't find anyone who would stand up and say, I'm responsible for that project. And everyone wanted to point their fingers at someone else. No one was willing to say, that's my project, I own that project.
Solutions, by the way, are not very costly. I think that's...
You mean mitigation?
The mitigation that permits a school to be built in the site is not costly. It has unfortunately been politicized to such a degree that what has been designed over the last few years for Belmont is completely unnecessary. But to assuage the fear factor and the hysteria that surrounded Belmont, it became necessary.
People said this is a toxic waste site. You just said it earlier.
Yes.
We spent a lot of money, the DA's office did, testing the soil at Belmont, where the school was. And it did not surpass legal limits for toxicity. It was well below them.
What was the bottom line?
Well, bottom line, we found that the schools never were built. and there are quite a number of people along the way, whether they be consultants, lawyers, or developers, who made considerable amounts of money in the process of putting together the deals and actually trying to develop these schools and these retail sites. We found in our report, I think fairly clearly demonstrated, that the real goal of the school construction project during that period of time was not to build schools. It was actually to try to generate more money for the district.
Oh.
And all these projects essentially failed. And what we have now, 10 years later, 15 years later, is we really have no new schools.
And I firmly believed in the Belmont project when it was under construction, and I firmly believe in it now. And there is nothing wrong with that project, and the school should be built.
What happened with Belmont is the district learned a very important lesson, that you can't take on projects like that without competence inside the school system.
The problem is that's, school districts or any government agency they're not really in the business of making money. They shouldn't be in the business of making money because there's a risk whenever you're in the business of making money. You can't risk the future of our kids.
The Inspector General and the people he had writing that report know absolutely nothing about real estate and nothing about school construction. And that's why I say it's a work of fiction. And to this day, we could never, those of us who were involved in trying to build schools could never get these people to debate us in public, those of us who were building the schools. We said, fine, you want to criticize it, do it in a public forum. Let us debate you. Don't surreptitiously write this stuff that nobody can challenge till it's published in the press. They have never done that. To this day, they haven't done that.
And you're